Good morning, everyone. I hope you can all see and hear me. My name is Maurice Hudson, and I am a member of the CSWA. We are operating under the auspices of the University of Southern California and the School of Social Work, and with the USC Libraries. We are so excited to have everyone here today. This meeting is being recorded, so if you or anyone that you know is having trouble joining in, we will try to make this recording available to all of you so that you can view it at a later time. I just wanted to acknowledge that we are having a little bit of technical difficulties today. So although we did have a very exciting number of registrants, I think we're getting close to 300. We've got about 74 with us now. It could be that some folks are having difficulty joining. And that number includes two of our distinguished panelists, Drs. Nunn and Dr. Solomon. So I'm very excited for them to be joining us soon. But in the meantime, we do have Alex Norman, who is a member of, let's see. Okay, I don't know if anyone else is a host, but a lot of things are appearing on my screen while I'm attempting to talk. So there we go. Is someone letting people into the room when they come before?
No. I'm letting people in.
I just got a message.
Or that when it pops up. So once again, to those of you who are just joining us, welcome to California Social Welfare Archives, which operates this California Social Work Hall of Distinction. We are an absolutely fabulous organization that is working hard to preserve the legacy of social welfare and social work in California. We are putting on this event today because we want to make sure that you all know about the Hall of Distinction induction ceremony, which will be taking place on October the 18th at 3 p.m. And we will be giving you a link for that event by the end of our event today. Our distinguished panelists are all affiliated with the Social Work Hall of Distinction. Oh, and if I could ask everyone to please mute their phones. We're hearing phones ringing in the background. We have Dr. Barbara Solomon, who's inducted into the Hall of Distinction in 2014, and Dr. Alex Norman, who was inducted in 2016. Joe Nunn is one of our committee members for the Hall of Distinction. So all three of our panelists today are heavily involved with the Social Work Hall of Distinction. And we want you to visit the Social Work Hall of Distinction page on the USC website, get to know all of our inductees. One in particular that might be of interest is one of the first inductees that we inducted back in 2002. Her name is Biddy Mason. She was a formerly enslaved person. And when I was rereading her biography, it occurred to me that we have to update some things because the times have changed. And we no longer refer to people as slaves. She was a person, a fully realized person who happened to be enslaved by some other folks. So the enslavers, you know, they can carry that label, but we're not going to look at her as a slave. But we want to highlight all of these folks because none of us will be here forever. We want to remember that we're standing on the shoulders of giants. And so I'm going to try to step back because I want to give as much time as we can to our inductees. But I just wanted to remind everyone of our reason for being here today, which is to try and benefit from Dr. Nunn, Dr. Solomon, and Dr. Norman, because they've been there. They've seen what we've gone. They've seen some of these things before. We don't always have to reinvent the wheel. And we're lucky enough to welcome Dr. Ruth White to guide us through this discussion today. I want to thank our coordinator, Shirley Aldana, for putting this all together. And I want to thank all of our attendees for the questions that you submitted. Dr. White reviewed all of those questions and she pulled some of them so that she can put them to our panelists and we can get some actual skills to take with us out into the field, to deal with clients, to deal with colleagues, and to make sure that we are impacting and intervening in a way that is anti-racist, but also in a way that's compassionate and it helps us to develop allyship and build rapport with those that we're working with. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Ruth White, who is a member of the USC faculty, who has a very, very impactful presence on social media, on regular media, and who's a voice that I think speaks so distinctively to so many of these issues impacting us. And she's then going to take us through this discussion and introduce our panelists. So Dr. White, thank you so much for joining us and being with us today.
There, thank you for having me. I had to unmute there. So yeah, my diversity work started a very long time ago, actually as a social work student at McGill University about in 1988, so a very, very long time ago. And what had happened is there was a police shooting of a young Black man in Montreal. And I was in my field placement at the Black student at the, it was called the Côte-Neige Black Community Association in Montreal, Canada. And so I collaborated with them and the police to improve police community relations. So it's been over 30 years. I actually taught as a master's of social work student. I was a teaching assistant for a class around diversity for social work students. It was a mandatory class in which we did things like invite panels of Indigenous people to talk about their experiences in boarding schools, which for some of you who know that history is a very ugly one. America had the same as Canada.
How do you turn the video off?
So, oh, that was interesting. And currently, I do diversity, equity, and inclusion work with corporations. What's been interesting now is that I've been asked on several occasions to do work around healing from the stress of racial trauma. So even though I wasn't offering that, people asked for that. And so that is some of the new work that I'm doing, which of course is based on some of what we've been experiencing right now. So what I want to do is I'm going to provide a little bit of context for discussion to get us started. And so this idea of whataboutisms, right? What does that really mean? Well, just think about the conversation around Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter, right? That's the essential foundation for a lot of this, where people say, well, Black Lives Matter, and somebody says, well, what about, right? Blue lives, all lives, etc. So I want to also define some terms for us as we have discussion. So whataboutism, the term refers to the practice of responding to an accusation or perceived hypocrisy with a counter situation or by raising a different issue, right? So it's literally what about, ... And so during the Cold War, the term was coined over human rights violations and systemic oppression perpetuated by one nation and criticizing others at the same time, right? So if you said, you know, Russia is doing something, then you say, well, what about China or what about America? Also to have some clarity around some of the definitions that we use when we're discussing racism, I just wanted to introduce a few terms. Most of you would be familiar with these, but just for clarity reasons. So a stereotype is a wildly held, but fixed and oversimplified image or idea, right? So it reduces people to one thing. Discrimination. Discrimination is based on stereotypes, and it is an unjust or prejudicial treatment. What is prejudice? So that's a preconceived and usually negative opinion or judgment. And white privilege. So of course, another very popular term right now, it refers to the unquestioned and unearned set of advantages, entitlements, benefits, and choices put on people solely because they are white. A couple of others, because I think it's important to understand racism if we're going to have a conversation about anti-racism. So racism is a belief that race is a fundamental determinant of human traits and capacities. Lastly, anti-racism or anti-racist has been made popular right now by the academic and writer Ibram X. Kendi. And he says that the only way to undo racism is to identify and describe it and then dismantle it. And being anti-racist is based on the conscious efforts and actions to provide equitable opportunities for all people on an individual and systemic level. So with that, I want to remind everybody, I know what I wanted to talk about. So one of the things that's important for us, this is the California Social Work Archive, is that we had an assignment at USC in a course called Leadership. And what it was is to highlight members who have been inducted into the Hall of Fame. And I want to say, for any of you who have not clicked on that link, it's really amazing to read the stories, the history of social work in the state and across the country, and to see the people that came before. For one thing, for me, it was really powerful to see a diverse slate of social workers, from Indigenous to Asian, African-American, to understand where we came from so we can know where we are going. So now I want to get started and introduce to you our guests. And so I will start with Dr. Norman. Dr. Norman received, somebody want to mute? There's some background action. So if everybody can please mute, that'd be great. Dr. Norman received his bachelor's degree from Morris Brown College, then attended Atlanta University, where he studied with Whitney Young and received his MSW. He returned to school in the early 1970s and received his PhD, becoming the first African-American doctoral graduate from the UCLA Department of Social Welfare. His association with UCLA continued when he became a lecturer, then acting associate professor, and later associate professor of community organization planning for the USC School of Public Policy and Social Research. Among his many professional activities, and these are really long, so I'm being very brief, and I again encourage you to go and read some of the profiles on the website. Dr. Norman served as the Associate Director of the Los Angeles Center for Social Research, among many other things. He's first and foremost a proponent of social justice and wellness. To that end, he has contributed to 9 books on topics related to multi-ethnic coalition building, evaluating community collaborations, and urban planning. Dr. Norman has advocated his first community by serving as the first vice president of the Long Beach Community Action Partnership, and is currently a member of the Long Beach Community Foundation Board of Trustees. Again, a long list of accomplishments that time does not permit me to go into a lot of detail here. Now I want to talk about Dr. Solomon. Hopefully she'll be on here soon. A gifted leader and social worker, Professor Emerita Barbara J. Solomon was born and raised in Houston. In 1950, at the young age of 15, Dr. Solomon entered Howard University in Washington, D.C., and graduated magna cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa with a bachelor's degree in psychology. She earned her MSW from the University of California, Berkeley. Go Bears. Only a few months after Rosa Parks' arrest in Montgomery. She later had the honor to hood Rosa Parks when she received an honorary doctorate degree at the University of Southern California. Dr. Solomon earned her DSW from the USC School of Social Work in 1966 and joined the school's faculty then. She became a full professor in 1977. Dr. Solomon was named Vice Provost for Graduate and Professional Studies and then Dean of the Graduate School in 1988. She was the first African-American Dean at the University of Southern California. She has published several volumes. She's a recipient of many honors, including the Faculty Who Make a Difference Award from the American Association of Higher Education, Social Work Educator of the Year Award, and the list goes on and on. She has also earned USC's highest honor, the Presidential Medallion. Last, I want to introduce Dr. Joseph Nunn, who received his undergraduate and graduate degrees at UCLA. Both his master's and doctorate degrees are in the field of social welfare. He is an LCSW. His interest in juvenile delinquency was generated during his 18 years as a probation officer for the County of Los Angeles. For a number of years, Dr. Nunn served on the City of Los Angeles Interagency Gang Task Force. He received the Alumni of the Year Award from the UCLA School of Social Welfare in 1990. He received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the California chapter of NASW in 2006. So I want to thank you all for joining us today. And I am going to get started on some questions. And I am seeing that I only see Dr. Norman. Is anybody else or any of the other panelists here? Maurice, can you see? Okay, well, Dr. Norman, I will start with you. So when we're thinking about this idea of what about, when we have someone who says, you know, you point out racism somewhere or discrimination, and they go to the what about. What are some of the ways, what are some of the tactics for turning the question back to the person who asked it? And force them in some way to be self-reflexive about what they're saying. So if you can help me with that, Dr. Norman.
Well, it's one of those things that I've had a lot of experience with, because being the first, you find that you often have to do two things. You have to represent, and at the same time, you have to present information. And so when I am faced with that situation, I don't deny the other person's interest. I acknowledge, yes, that is true. However, I'm speaking to another issue. Let's deal with that issue later. So it doesn't put the person in a defensive posture. So if a person says, if I say Black Lives Matter and they say all lives matter, I say, of course, you're right. And that's why I want everybody to specifically understand that Black lives matter along with all of those other lives. So it's a way, I think, of avoiding the logical dodge. Because when a person says that all lives matter, it's not untrue. And so rather than dealing with it in a denial aspect, if we embrace it, then we embrace the person too. And it's okay to indicate to that person, because that's a concern of yours, I would really like to get you to express some interest. It's a way of encouraging the conversation. In other words, of keeping the communication open.
I am wondering, so for those of you who are just joining us, and for everybody here, I just want you to know that at 9 o'clock today, we had a trial run and everybody was on and everything worked. And this is technology for you. Everything was working and then nothing was working. So be patient with us as my colleague Shirley Aldana from USC. I think I see another face of my panel. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm so happy to see you, Dr. Nunn. Okay, so we are considering the question right now about how whataboutisms play out. And so Dr. Norman did talk about what you do personally in terms of personal interactions. What I'm gonna ask you now, Dr. Nunn, is how can we address this whataboutism when we see it in practice with clients or communities or agencies?
Excuse me, folks, I'm holding my cell phone because I couldn't log on with my computer. So I'm gonna do what I can with this. You know, one of the things that I realized very early on is that for me, there was a whole lot of anger when people would ask me those kind of questions or make those kind of statements. So the first thing I had to do was check myself out and say, okay, is this person trying to be, are they attacking? So I made a difference between understanding, is it ignorance or malice of intent? And if it's ignorance, then I try to take a different tack in dealing with that person. If they were to make a statement that I disagreed with, one of the things that I have to really work on right now, because it's not like I'm not there, but is to simply say, tell me more about that. And as they begin to unravel what their thinking is, it gives me an opportunity then to say, okay, now this is how I'm hearing what you're saying, and this is what I think about it. And so it's kind of keeping the dialogue going. Whereas before, when my emotions are there and when I'm angry, I'm more likely to just be abrupt and turn the person off.
Mm-hmm. So it's taking a moment to pause and listen to understand perspective. And I think it's so important right now because we have this bifurcation, you know, this split of people not being able to hear each other and everybody being stuck in their own position. And as a profession, and I think I see Dr. Solomon about to get in here. So yes, as a profession, I think we have to model understanding and tolerance and conversation, discussion, dialogue with people who may or may not agree with us. And I think it's an important thing to happen right now because I think the further and further we go apart, the harder it is for us to actually learn from each other and to actually change hearts and minds. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Solomon. Yay, I'm so happy that we're all here right now. We are talking about the whataboutisms, and I have asked the panel before about how to deal with it personally. Dr. Nunn was talking about how to do it with clients. And what I want you to think about is, with our code of ethics in mind, how do we address these whataboutisms among colleagues and supervisors?
Well, there's certainly, I can think of at least one whataboutism that I'm very concerned about. And it's, I get, what about the fact that we have all of these now Black politicians, Black Congress people, Black mayors, Black chiefs of police, and Black mayors and police chiefs who actually can hold police chiefs accountable and the police departments accountable. And yet still we are getting Black men killed by police in cities where we have Black politicians in charge. So I get the, what about that? That must mean that it's not racism because look who's in charge. It must be those bad dudes who just absolutely do something that's rare and are not being held accountable. And I get very concerned because it is very clear that it's not just those Black dudes. It's that those police mayors and police chiefs do not have actual power to make a difference, and who may themselves have accepted the fact that it is a rare condition. And so this is a whataboutism that I absolutely am concerned about and think we have to find some way to manage.
Yes, and I think that goes back to this conversation about, does racism still exist if we do have these African Americans in power as somehow being an example that we've somehow gone beyond what needs to happen. And I was reading, something was circulating around, and it sort of was saying, all these African Americans have achieved all these things, which was proof or evidence. And I kept saying, well, if you open the door for one person, doesn't mean that everybody can come in behind you. And you're right about also the difference between having power, say, over a city and having power over individuals within your organization, right? And we've seen, of course, over and over, all sorts of organizations that have been faced with staff, leaders, etc., who have said or done things that are racist, and that organizations have to somehow manage. I actually wrote one about, I wrote a Medium article a couple of years ago when Starbucks had that incident in Philadelphia and how they decide to approach that. So thanks, Dr. Solomon. I want to start, shift a little bit away from the whataboutisms explicitly. And you have said that social work education needs to meet the moment. Dr. Solomon, what do you mean by this?
Oh, what I mean is that maybe a year ago, I would not have dreamed of the possibilities that now social work education has to really make some changes. That there are things that have happened which have meant that there are people who never believed that systematic racism was real. And after George Floyd, when absolutely people were able to see for themselves, and then we began to see all of the instances where cell phones took pictures, where the social media really began to transport a lot of these data, that suddenly people who never before had accepted the fact that systemic racism existed became completely committed to doing something about it. So we've seen these hordes of people in the streets of all colors who are coming saying, that shouldn't happen. What can we do? And I think it's also being asked, why don't social workers come, and why aren't social workers more involved in these situations where it's mental health issues or domestic violence or what have you? And I think we now have an opportunity to be listened to in ways that we haven't been before. So that's what I meant about this is the moment, that we need to be able to specify how social work education can actually be part of the solution.
Thank you for that. And I think it's a really important issue. I did a discussion recently around, the 25th anniversary of the book Unfaithful Angels, that was talking about the shift of social work from macro practice, social change in the larger sector, to clinical practice. And of course, there's a lot of factors driving that, third-party payments, licensing, all of that. And I think there's some part of us that needs to really stay committed to that mission of fighting social justice, not from the individual level, but from the systemic level as social workers. And how do we do that? And to really encourage, facilitate, support. I always say what doesn't get paid for doesn't get done, right? We don't have courses, a lot of, community organizing, all of these courses that used to be a required class are not anymore in social work education. So I totally hear you. Thank you for that, Dr. Solomon. So I want to talk to Dr. Nunn to talk about this idea of social workers as agents of social control. And how does that play out in terms of the way we practice?
Well, I think it's important for social workers to recognize, as we think about the police and we look at what they do, is as a good social worker, self-awareness is really key. And starting with myself and then looking at our profession and how we go about doing what we do. And people who know me know that I've been on this social control thing for a long time. But if you look at the work that we do, a lot of it has to do with gatekeeping. We apply labels. We give access to resources. And in some instances, our role is very similar to that of the police, in that it's direct behavior control. Look at child welfare workers, and you look at what social workers do in corrections. So by acknowledging who we are, we can then begin to think about, okay, what is our role in the social
What happened to your sound?
I don't have any sound here.
The host muted everyone.
It's about whataboutisms.
The host muted everyone. I've unmuted myself.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can. I don't know. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry about that. I don't know.
Dr. Ruth, if you can ask everyone to unmute themselves. Thank you.
So, okay, so panelists unmute, everybody else, please be muted. Thank you, Dr. Nunn. So yes, in terms of this social control, I think it's really important because I often tell my students just how much power we have as social workers, as stakeholders, but also, owners of the key that access a lot of resources, but also in some ways, sometimes I feel like supports the systems that can be very oppressive for people, and how we challenge that role, because I always tell our students what we do is enforce government policy, right? A lot of what we do is based on laws, practices, policies that governments set, and those same governments can be very oppressive. And how do we then, going back to what Dr. Solomon was talking about, how do we then shift from some acceptance of the power that we have and to challenge our own role in enforcing some of this? Dr. Norman, are you still there?
I am here.
Okay, perfect. So you have worked with the LAPD for more than a decade. I want you to explain what is meant by the command and control model of policing and the problems with this model.
Well, the command and control model of policing is really based on the military. If you look at the academy curriculum for police, pretty much parallels the military. And what the command and control is involved in is a chain of command. And many of our public institutions and some of our private institutions are modeled on that. That there is a chain of command in which rank has its privilege. And so the question is not to question the person in the higher position, but to obey that person. So it's command and obey. And what the police have done is taken that to command and control. They command the organization and its personnel, but they control the environment. So when they arrive on the scene, the first thing that they're thinking is to control this scene. Now, when you looked at the George Floyd murder by Derek Chauvin, that was an example of command and control. If you recall, one of his colleagues, one of his officers asked, "Do you think we ought to roll him on his side?" And Derek Chauvin said, "No, let's keep it right here." That's command and control. He was a ranking officer there. And even though that lesser ranked officer knew something was wrong, he didn't question it and he didn't challenge it. And so the command and control model is based on a white supremacy model. And unless you change that model, that white supremacy model, no amount of community policing or tinkering around the edges is going to basically change the function of the police, as we found out with the Los Angeles Police Department. When Chief Willie Williams was there, community policing had advisory committees. They met with community people. They co-chaired committees, and it was an attempt to bring collaboration and cooperation into law enforcement. As soon as Williams left and another chief came, a different form of policing took place because it was still within a command and control system. So unless that command and control system is ejected completely, we cannot change the relationship between the police and the community.
Thank you very much. So this is for all of you. And I think Dr. Solomon, you're still muted. So if you can unmute yourself so you can engage in this part of the conversation. I want you to think about what skills and knowledge do you think that social workers need to engage in anti-racist practice at both the macro and micro level? So I'll start with you, Dr. Solomon.
Oh, well, I think there's several skills that are extremely important, particularly as we start thinking about systemic racism, that the social worker in many instances, have I?
No, somebody else is still, I have to. Oh.
Thank you. Later.
Excuse me all again. Dr. Solomon, you would have to unmute yourself again because people are still not muting in the background. So Dr. Solomon, you're muted. If you can unmute. Okay, while I try to get Dr. Solomon unmuted. Dr. Solomon?
I'm clicking now.
There you go. Yes.
Finally. Yes, I was talking about the kind of skills that social work needs to bring. I actually believe that social work, now that it is being asked to come to the table to start dealing with these issues of police violence, there is an opportunity to begin to try to bring some professionalization to police departments. I think that when you consider the fact that police really have very few educational standards. You go to the police academy, and I don't believe that in the police academy, they are talking about such things as ethics, such things as how to hold your partner accountable, how to deal with the value of the security of the community, how to collaborate with the community to build trust. These are things that could be included in the education of the police department. And here we may have an opportunity to get the funding to get social workers and police in a collaborative kind of situation where the police are actually being educated to serve and not to control, as we've been hearing. And so I think that social work skills in helping to actually collaborate to effectively deal with macro systems could be extremely helpful here.
Thank you. Yeah, I many years ago, I visited London and did a 1-week immersion into their social welfare systems. And there were actually a couple of boroughs in the city where social workers actually sat in the police department and went out on these calls of things like domestic violence and people with mental health problems, because as we know, this has been also a real problem in terms of managing that. Dr. Norman, I would like you to address what skills and knowledge do you think social workers need to engage in anti-racist practice at both the macro and micro levels?
Well, I think as social workers, we have to develop a philosophy. And if our philosophy is one of social justice, then we have to practice that. It becomes not just a philosophy, but a practice. And what that means is that when you see injustice occurring, you must do something about it. And generally, we have been outward thinking, and we've not really considered the organization of which we were a part. And so if you're doing social justice work, we often say you must speak truth to power, but you can't speak truth to power if you don't speak truth to your colleagues and your friends. And so in social work, we often operate in systems that themselves are based on white supremacy. And we look outward. So what we have to do is look both ways. We'll have to look outward and we'll have to look inward. Just to cite you one example, as a professor at UCLA, I was very concerned with social justice outward, but we were running a racialized institution. And so I commented that we were being perceived as a racialized institution, which the dean took as a personal affront. And yet I had to say that because it was a fact. It was clear to me and it was clear to other people, but nobody was saying anything. And so I look at social work as a continuum of practice. I don't look at the bifurcation of macro and micro, or the trifurcation of macro, meso, and micro. It means that one must use the appropriate skill for the person in the situation, and we deal with persons in situation. If we're in an individual situation, we use our clinical skills. If we're in a group situation, we use our group skills. And if we're in a community or an organizational situation, we use our macro skills. But it's the same social worker. So what we must do is also be true to Shakespeare said, this above all to thine own self be true. So if we're true to our social justice theme in social justice work, you look at equality for everyone. And whether people are in the room or not, you stand for them. So if someone makes an anti-Semitic statement and I'm in the room and there are no Jews in the room, I am bound to confront that statement because anti-Semitism is a part of white supremacy as much as anti-blackness is.
Thank you, Dr.
I'd also like to speak to that because I can recall at USC when I was clearing out for the summer and I had my two kids, my two little boys there, and I go out where they were supposed to be waiting for me, and I didn't see them. And I saw them waving from across the street, and I told them, come back. They said, well, the campus police told us we didn't belong here. The campus police, we told them that our mother teaches here, and they didn't believe us. And they sent us off the campus. Well, I became extremely upset about that. And I had this social work colleague who happened to be chairing, the first woman chairing the faculty senate. We stormed to the police, campus police. We insisted that they had to change, they had to have training for their policemen how to deal with people in the community because we had heard that they were throwing people off of campus. The ultimate consequence was that we not only had social work involved in training in the campus police, we changed the name. It was no longer campus police, it was the Department of Public Safety. And I think that this whole issue of having to speak truth to power that Alex is talking about is absolutely essential.
Thank you, Dr. Solomon. So, Dr. Nunn, how would you like to add on? I know your colleagues have taken a lot of time in explaining some of this, but there are lots of different skills that we can have as social workers. And I would like your contribution to this particular question.
Well, I certainly agree with what's been said already around looking at our institutions because that's a strong influence. As a matter of fact, I would suggest that each organization has a culture and that we tend to look at the people with whom we work through the lens of the organization that we're a part of. And so if I see someone and I'm a probation officer, I'm looking for a delinquent. If I'm a mental health worker, I'm looking for someone with emotional problems. If I'm a police officer, I'm looking for somebody that's a criminal. And so each organization tends to apply certain labels based on what we do, not who the people are. Something occurs in a neighborhood and people in the neighborhood are concerned and they see it and they say, okay, this person needs some kind of assistance. But who is contacted and who responds is very, very critical because each organization will apply certain labels. And depending on those labels, it will determine what happens to that particular individual. And so unless we start having more dialogue across organizations, and I don't just mean because we have had incidents in the past where the top people of each organization like DCFS and probation and mental health, they meet. But it doesn't carry down to the level of the worker who's actually having contact with clients in the community. I wanted to follow up too on saying something about working with police officers. One of the things that tends to happen, no matter how good the training is, no matter what's being done in the academy, is that when that rookie gets out on the streets, he or she is immediately told, okay, forget all that stuff you learned up there. Here's how we really do the job out here. So the type of leadership that we have in these organizations, such as the police department and social work for that matter, makes a big difference. They found with airline pilots, for example, that airline pilots with authoritarian personalities were dangerous because they didn't listen when other people around them said, this is what's going on. They found that the best pilots were those that would gather information from various places, weigh that information, and then make decisions. And so we really have to look at how our systems operate and begin to think about not only the white supremacy that permeates all of these organizations, and I say all of them, but also how we're going to respond and use our social work values within that context.
Yes, and I want to say something here because it's one of, I taught micropractice for a long time, and one of the things that I'm seeing as a trend is not just, you know, our shift from macro to heavily micro, but also just the fact that time does not allow. So for the way that we construct our agencies, what workloads look like, etc., it seems that politics is always an add-on to our work, right? It's not central to our work. It's what you do after work. It's what you do in the professional association, and not as much what, you know, foster care agencies and all these other organizations might do in terms of accessing political power and really engaging our clients in that process. You know, there used to be a time when you'd put, you know, clients in a bus and go have a meeting at City Hall. And I think there's so much less of that. I had a student once who I got her all fired up, and she actually did just that and got in trouble because she had not asked permission to take the clients to that particular destination. But it was interesting for her that she could take them on a field trip, but she couldn't take them down to City Hall. And I think we need to also think about how do we engage our clients and our institutions in the fight for racial justice, in anti-racist practice, because as much as anti-racist practice is about individuals, it's also about some of these policies that in some ways tie our hands as social workers, and we need to fight to get those manacles off of our wrists, so to say. So now that we've talked about what are some of the skills that we need to have as social workers, I want us to think about social work education. And how do we then, in our educating of the next generation of social workers, and you've all taught in the classroom and trained social workers, how do you think we can educate social workers for the kinds of skills and knowledge that they need to have an anti-racist practice in 2020 and beyond? I would, Dr. Norman, do you want to start?
Yes. One, that's a heavy question, because what it does is it demands that we do the same thing with our social work model that we do with the police model. That we reject that complete model of social work practice that we have, because we have been agents of social control for so long. And so my suggestion would be that we develop principled social work practice, that there are certain principles around which we can organize the profession, and that those principles are shared by people in the field, because social work is a field of practice. And yet we exclude the very people who are in the field from developing the curriculum. So what I would see would be a collaborative approach between academics and practitioners in developing what should be the core social work field of practice, and that we develop that curriculum around those principles. I suggested this when I was at UCLA, that we take a year off, and instead of the regular courses, that we have the basic field course, but that all of our academic courses would be developed between the field, the faculty, and the students. And we test that curriculum for the next year. I would still advocate for the same kind of a strategy, that it be a collaborative, inclusive strategy that includes the essential components of social work practice. Because theory informs practice, which informs research, which informs theory, which informs practice.
Yes, I just want to give an example. When I was a professor at Seattle University, or got tenure many years ago, one of the things I did, I love service learning, because I think as social workers, and I think Dr. Norman, it made me think about this. So I would teach a community well, I started with my social policy class. And what I started doing was having small nonprofits who did not have capacity for doing policy work to come and pitch to my students, and my students would help them with their policy practice. They would write a policy brief, they would go down to City Hall, etc. And my classroom became the lab that I did that supervision because of capacity reasons. I used to do the same for community organizing class, right? Now this is separate from the field placement. And so community organizing class, they'd go out and organize for different agencies. And then at one point I realized, why don't I have the community organizing students do the community work for the same agencies that my social policy students were doing policy work. And I think it was really important for students to actually do the work and not just talk about the work, and to see the power of that as students, which was separate from their field placement, which was often more clinical, case management, all of that. But I think it's important for students to access that power and to get supported in implementing strategies that use the power and knowledge that we have to advocate with and on behalf of our clients. Dr. Nunn, what would you say about what we can include in our education?
Well, I think that we need to really focus on one of our abilities and skills in building collaboration between individuals, groups, and communities. And at one point, Alvin Toffler, in his book, Third Wave, mentioned that in the future, people were going to become isolated in their worlds of work. And there will be key people who will be able to work across systems and bring people together. So I think social work, we need to really focus on how we're able to do that and how we're able to connect folks. And again, work across these boundaries and barriers. Again, each organization has its own cultural view of the world. So how do we get social workers to understand police officers to understand mental health workers? I thought when we had the PET teams in Los Angeles, that really made a whole lot of sense. Psychiatric emergency teams, where you had different people working together. And it's going to take time before we realize that we really need to focus more in that direction.
So we're getting close to the end of our time, and I do want to respect people's time, but if people want to spend a few more minutes with us, because we did have all these crazy technical difficulties in the beginning, I thank you for your patience and understanding. So I do want to get to one question before we wrap up. And as some of you or all of you know, Trump has decided that we shouldn't have any more race training. So how do we respond to this as a profession and as people living in a country where we're trying to figure out how to live and work and coexist at this really important time in history? And Dr. Solomon, I'd love you to weigh in.
Well, I absolutely believe that the training of police is extremely important, and the involvement of social work and other professions that are social change agents to absolutely defy any political attempt to reduce our opportunity to affect anti-racist kinds of behaviors. And of course, our president is absolutely involved in anti-racist behavior. It seems extremely important to me for social work, for example, to begin to connect our own disparate parts so that we work together effectively. And I'm thinking about, for example, a situation when in the public schools in Los Angeles, in South Central Los Angeles, there was all kinds of necessary work to be done on the toilets, in the building. Kids were running from school at the end of the day because they had to go to the bathrooms and it was so nasty that they couldn't go in there. When the social worker there in the school who was actually doing a parent training program in the school questioned the principal about when these were going to be done, when the work was to be done, was told, oh, well, you know, there's delayed kind of processes and it'll be several months before we can get in there. Well, that social worker went to a public relations person who had connections with the media and arranged for a media person to come in and take pictures of the toilets. Mm-hmm. This was put on the news, and in 2 weeks, they were fixed. It seems to me that where we are seeing problems at the micro level, we need to be already prepared to move to those we know at the macro level who may be able to bring this about. Mm-hmm. And I think when we get to the whole business of police brutality and what is happening, not just to Black men, but our kids, when you can get killed as a child because of the police, and you have no way of holding police accountable, of being trained, of having the kind of training required to be able to respond in a very empathic way to all of our residents, so that protect and serve really means something. Mm-hmm. I think it is absolutely essential that we get our educational system in social work so that we are, as Alex said, having principles that we can follow so that this happens.
Thank you so much. So it is 11:03, and what I want to do here is thank you all for showing up. There are a couple more questions that I know people really wanted to ask, but time does not permit. I'm going to bring Maurice back in here in a second, but I want to remind people that there will be an induction ceremony on October 18th at 3 p.m. Pacific time. You will get a link that Shirley has put in the chat box that you can register for this activity. I do want to say too that for the social workers that are out there listening to this conversation, I want you to think about right now, what can you do in your role as a social worker at work, and not just after work, not just what do you do on the side, how can you incorporate social justice action into your practice so that we are part of an anti-racist movement and that we are active in that movement all the time, whether it is, you know, like I do, I write blog posts, I make YouTube videos. If you have to go to your boss, I always say to my students, go to your supervisor and say, I want to spend 1 hour a week at City Hall. I want that to be part of my job, that I go and talk about the issues that are important for my clients, whatever that is, foster care, is it adoption, is it domestic violence, whatever it is, to incorporate, I don't know, 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. I always say, if you can get half a day to do macro practice as part of your job, so that it's not something that we do as an extra, but it becomes part of our move, part of our engagement in this really, really powerful moment that we're in right now, where we're seeing white women in Louisville standing between Black people and the police holding hands. And I think, you know, we are at this very, very powerful juncture as a society. So I would like to bring Maurice back on to wrap us all up. And thank you again all for joining us, for being patient with us as we had technology difficulties. I hope you got some of your questions answered and you feel inspired and motivated to go out and fight the power.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. We had a fantastic panel. I know folks have to get running, so all I'm going to say is please look in the chat box, find that link for the Hall of Distinction. This is what I like to call an amuse-bouche. I never worked I never ate in a fancy restaurant, but I worked in a lot of them. So this amuse-bouche that you just had, if you want the entree, if you want the dessert, if you even want the salad, come join us at Hall of Distinction. There, you'll see Dr. White there, she'll be there. I'm sure you'll see Dr. Nunn, Dr. Norman, and I'm gonna insist that Dr. Solomon be with us too. They have so much more to share with you, as do all of our other dozens of inductees into the Hall of Distinction. Again, I want to thank everybody who helped put this together from the Hall of Distinction Committee and Working Group, and wish everyone a safe and healthy day out there. We look forward to seeing you again. And by the way, this is the first in a series. Later this year and next year, we're going to have more of these involving some of our Hall of Distinction inducted members, so that you'll continue to benefit from their knowledge, wisdom, and experience. So thank you so much for taking the time today. We can't wait to keep connecting with you. We will see you in October at the Hall of Distinction.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Please stay tuned for the 2020 Hall of Distinction induction ceremony lineup and registration information. To register, please find us on the web at cswahod2020.eventbrite.com. Thank you for joining us. We'd love to hear your feedback. Please go to bit.ly/whataboutisms feedback to fill out a short survey. Thank you.